I'm Matthew Benson. I am the Sudan's research director at the London School of Economics Conflict and Civicness Research Group. And we are part of the Peace and Conflict Evidence Research Platform. We work on a bunch of countries, just to introduce us. We work on Somalia, which colleague Nisar Majid will talk about, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria. And so, yeah, we're quite busy with all of that stuff. But I think to just introduce what's going on here, the inspiration for this project is really built around one of the core themes of Peace Rep. And so one of the things that we do within the CCRG is we work almost exclusively with in-country networks throughout all of the countries that we just described. In Sudan, we work with a feminist network of researchers, which Raga Makawi has set up. In South Sudan, we work with a bridge network of South Sudanese researchers. In Syria, we work with an incredible team of Syrian researchers. And same in Somalia and in Afghanistan, we've been working with a lot of things, particularly with the US pullout. So with that, it's really driven and co-produced by what's taking place on the ground. So a lot of what's been speaking in the previous day, it's really core of what we do. But more than anything, actually, it's driven by this idea of civicness. So it's this logic of political of authority that's very different and distinct from what we understand as Alex de Waal's kind of concept of the political marketplace, this extractive production, like where politics is all about monetization of things and trading favors and all this kind of stuff that we vividly see in Sudan in particular. But it's actually about this logic of authority, which isn't just built around working with civil society, but it's actually working with alternatives that you find within government, within activist communities, within doctors' unions, and all these kind of things. And that's what we really try and support as a way to actually change the political economy, because we're really talking about more than just sort of helping an activist group here or whatever it may be. We're actually talking about broad scale at some level, and particularly when we get into the resource base of the countries in which we work in, especially in Sudan, especially in South Sudan, the countries in which I do my research. It's actually about shifting the national political economy. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is in relation to that, but the broader framing here is also this idea that the world is actually fragmenting in new ways. We see this partly with Brexit. We see this with new actors who are emerging within the regions that we work in, especially in Sudan. And with this comes this Pax Americana is perhaps falling apart in other ways. And with that comes these new actors and new ways of being able to extract revenue that is arguably pushed and shifted Sudan apart through a long history of things in ways that are going to be talked about today. So one of the biggest impetuses for this project is a new piece of work that Raga Makawi, Shara Srinivasan at Cambridge, and myself are working on to actually study and understand concepts of civicness or medania, which are really embedded within Sudanese political thought and have a long history, which Raga Makawi is going to talk about. But we're really trying to actually look at if the world is changing in this way, if countries are fragmenting in these particular ways, if Sudan is literally at this sort of critical juncture where business as usual is literally no longer possible, as everyone who looks and understands Sudan knows, then how can things be done differently? And how can you actually work with civic actors on the ground who are literally putting their lives on the line and did the impossible and got rid of Bashir and were the world's sort of leading pro-democracy movement, and yet they've somehow been failed by the international community and ignored and sidelined, or at least unable to be at the table in ways that we hope to have an open discussion with everyone here, because I know there are multiple perspectives on this. But we'd like to try and understand how is it that you can do things differently with an international system which is not actually built to work with these sort of bottom-up, almost like Occupy Wall Street sort of ways of doing things. So how is it that you can reimagine the international system to support these actors who've been historically marginalized to such a tragic degree? And one of the big things here is that we actually do not want Sudan to be a cautionary tale. We do not want it to be the first country to undergo this thing. We'd like to be able to actually do something rapidly and be able to respond. So the hope is that we're not just looking at this as sort of this case study in real time of how things go badly and where the mistakes were made, but how we can actually change and shift and work together, both us as the kind of intellectuals and academics, but also with a lot of you in the room who are practitioners and budgets to be able to support these kind of things. So it's really trying to have an open and honest discussion about that. So with that in mind, I have Raga Makawi here. I know Raj's bio already, but I guess I'll say a bit of it. Raga is we work extremely closely within the Sudan research team at LSE. I could not do it without Raga. She's an editor of African Arguments, which many of you will be familiar with. She's one of the co-authors of the leading book on Sudan's revolution, which many of you will perhaps be familiar with. She's finishing up her MPhil at Oxford and hopefully to move on to do a DPhil and these kind of things, and has been doing her own work, which is sort of leading research on what's taking place on civicness and Medania and so forth. So Raja will speak first, just to kind of frame what's taking place. What is civicness? What is Medania? How is it embedded? Raja herself is one of kind of deeply connected and embedded within these networks and feminist networks in particular in Sudan, and will speak to that reality. Then we have Kholood Khair, who I also know her bio very well, and we've collaborated on other things before. But Kholood is the founding director of Confluence Advisory, which is a think tank in Khartoum that works on policy research, though was a think tank. I was going to say, you often say it's a think and do tank, right? Isn't that your? It was in Khartoum, yes. It's now in searching for a new, it's working remotely at the moment. And so Kholood has over a decade of experience in research and programming and policy in Sudan and across the Horn of Africa. She has degrees from Oxford and from SOAS. And so Kholood will really be speaking about the humanitarian side of things and also the regional context that has produced a lot of this, because it's not Sudan happening in isolation. It is, of course, a representation or a mirror of what the world is also going through. And so then we also, at the end of the panel, we'll have, we're kind of bringing things, framing things in a broader way is Deen Sharp, who's also a colleague at the London School of Economics. And so Deen is an urban geographer focused on the Arab world, and he'll bring in a lot of lessons on his work on urbanization of violence and conflict and social mobilization. He himself is the co-editor of Beyond the Square, Urbanism and Arab Uprisings, and also Open Gaza, Architectures of Hope and Reconstructions of Violence in Syria, is his book he's working on now. And he himself has been based in Khartoum up until, of course, last month's or April's violence. So Deen's perspective will really be trying to look at what are the lessons that we can draw from other contexts in which there have been urban violence that's taken place. So we see Syria as one of the major examples. What are the lessons that we've learned from other attempts at challenging these overarching political economy of things in the Arab world? And so he'll be speaking about lessons from the Arab Spring and also looking at what are the challenges and contestation that takes place both during war, introducing this concept of herbicide, but also talking about things that will take place in what we hope to be soon some sort of post-conflict reconstruction period. So we're trying to both paint a clear view of what's taken place, take stock of what's going on, but also look at where things are moving in the next, what we hope to be the kind of future that does not repeat the same mistakes as the past. So with that, we'll open with Raja, and then we'll have questions at the end after Deen speaks. So.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you all for being here today. I'm just going to start my presentation by giving a short kind of a brief background and rationale to the centering of civicness as a research paradigm as part of our work at LSE. This rationale is kind of, limited to the purpose of this workshop. So the reasons that we're studying or centering civicness are so broad. But for the purposes of this workshop and the participants, I've highlighted two reasons as to the importance of why civicness should be centered as a research paradigm. One is that the role of civic politics and civic actors is long overdue. Centering the role of civic actors and civic politics is long overdue because it speaks to a need to overcome the current crisis and the proliferation of armed actors and the growth of a militarized presence within and around the state. Generally, but in Sudan particularly. And it also speaks to the limited success of peace mechanisms. And reflecting on what Kholood said yesterday, it's also important, it could be an important replacement for the crisis of failing states and our dwindling trust in them. Our research mainly questions how we can engage with civic politics in a way that helps us achieve a shift in our understanding and application of good governance towards a more viable transition and longer-term stability of, obviously, Sudan, but the Horn. Okay. From our findings on researching civicness as both a political discourse and a practice, in the case of Sudan, civicness has come to mean many things. And obviously, we're talking about the timeline post-revolution from 2018 until the war erupted in the middle of April. So the standard definition, which is absent in, the standard definition of civicness is the absence of military or militarized presence in politics. However, this definition kind of contradicts Sudan's traditional and functional model, which predominated during the Bashir era and throughout to some larger extent in the periods of the transition under Hamdouk's reign, where there was a synergy of the community of the state. And here I mean, the state, its institutions, whether militarized or not, civil society, business, and traditional sectors. So this kind of amalgamation of actors all work together with a degree of functionality. But since the revolution, Sudan has seen a countrywide engagement with politics as both a discourse and a practice, which is unheard of before. This engagement had both positive and negative implication for the democratic transition, which is obviously to be expected. Now, the deepening of political process, which came from this kind of countrywide engagement with politics, is neither predictable nor controllable, and has created parallel and decentralized political trajectories, not always reconcilable with each other or central state politics. As a result, we're seeing multiple narratives on what civic politics is, civic rule is, and by extension, there are different definitions of democracy emerging. An important finding from our research on civic politics with implications for the existing political processes, whether they were peace, development, or humanitarian intervention, is that a civic-centered approach is always important to kind of overcome and help us to strengthen previous limited dysfunctional approaches on peacemaking and state building. I'm particularly interested in, so basically what we've managed to do through civic politics is try and kind of revise some of the existing models on kind of, as I said, peacemaking, state building, development, and so on and so forth. I'm particularly interested in kind of representing to some degree the term kind of inclusivity, because it was thrown around quite a bit yesterday. So if we're going to kind of reflect on the idea of inclusivity through civic politics, a different definition emerges. So inclusivity in peacemaking and in kind of development seems to mean in principle that everyone has a voice and a place at the table. However, our research on civicness found limitations in the concept of inclusivity. And these limitations kind of emanate from this idea of relational politics, which basically means that access and outcome of any political process is shaped by people's relationships to each other, while operating within a socio-economic and a political hierarchy. So the negotiations and concessions done within these relational politics determine to what degree any process is inclusive. And Sudanese civic politics, since the revolution, is a living laboratory of tried and tested moments of inclusion, with mostly failed, but sometimes, successes. So the idea of inclusiveness isn't as easy or as achievable as we sometimes seem to think or imagine. Now I want to talk a little bit about civicness as politics. So the past 5 years since the revolution, we saw kind of, a proliferation of, as well as an evolution in civic politics. This basically means that there was more engagement of the public in political affairs. And the way it was done was in untried and unscripted means with a variety of outcomes. Now, the evolution of civic ideology and process has been remarkable. People have built grassroots institutions and found ways of formalizing them over the political and socially normative, which isn't something easy. So the Sudan Resistance Committees, or the neighborhood committees, as they've been come to known, is just one. More remarkable than the committees themselves are the kind of adjunct systems that have been built around them in order to facilitate their functionality as a governance body, as well as streamline and a set of normative rules and guidelines to see through their kind of day-to-day running. So it's not just the resisting committees that are kind of an interesting kind of body or a system of governance to look at, but it's also kind of more telling how people have managed to kind of connect these committees across the countries with larger civic bodies in order to see through their political agenda. Now, again, for the purposes of this workshop, I wanted to kind of reflect on two themes that have come out of this project of civicness as politics in Sudan. So peacemaking and good governance as a basis for policymaking. In the case of peacemaking and conflict resolution, I think it's important to note that civic discourses that were produced by the committees from the early days of the revolution engaged to a large degree with the crisis of state violence. It also kind of, dealt with the matter of evolving patterns of violence in the periphery, particularly in Darfur, and their relationship to the never-ending cycles of, coups. And this is something that exists in the the narrative and the literature that the resistant committees have produced in multiple formats throughout the last 4 years. In the pre-war discourse, the pre-war civic discourse, which was from 2018 up until the war broke out in April, the focus was always on finding an alternative formula to the current model of peacemaking, which basically, according to the committees, gives peace dividends in exchange for wealth and power. To them, this doesn't work. They believe this formula didn't resolve the underlying problem of power concentration and despotism, but further enabled armed actors to find each other and to use the state to further bluster their interest against the communities they're meant to represent. Consider, for example, the role of the JPA in aiding the coup, as well as driving renewed cycles of violence in Darfur between 2021 and 2022. The principle upon which peacemaking for state building is based, according to the civic agenda, is meant to kind of encourage and facilitate a no negotiation, no partnership, no legitimacy approach to all armed and military actors. A civic peacemaking model that was being debated for the past few years but remains incomplete when the war erupted was in process. So I think it's important for us researchers, but also policymakers and anyone who's engaged in Sudan to kind of consider this alternative literature and find ways to kind of, adapt and use it for the purpose of, a more reliable transition in Sudan after the war. In the post-war phase, the civic narrative was more about engaging conflict resolution. So the idea was to basically, through the resisting committees again, and through these extended civic grassroots bodies, the resisting committees have been, first of all, running an anti-war campaign. So they've been kind of publishing messages for the public to kind of warn them against the perils of being kind of drawn into this war process on any terms. And as part of this, they've been trying to kind of produce a more kind of balanced narrative around how kind of, around ethnic politics and how different communities should relate to each other and at times of crisis. So I mean, another aspect of the conflict resolution has been for the resisting committees to, you know, to publish daily communiques to try and kind of thwart the effect of the propaganda that's been kind of, you know, that is published on a daily basis by both SAF and RSF. So you've got not just these two voices running kind of, you know, with the propaganda, with war propaganda. You've got a third kind of, you know, more balanced voice that comes from the resisting committees. And I think it's very important, and we need to build on it moving forward. Moving on to the second aspect of civicness as politics, which is good governance and policy making. I think the civic movement in Sudan has managed to develop a definition for good governance, one that enables citizenry through a social contract. So again, it's not just about the provision of services. It's not just about the functionality of, you know, a running state. It's not just about stability. It's about connecting all these, you know, themes together in relation to kind of, you know, the well-being of the community and the Sudanese public. There's always been active participation in local governance, which started in Sudan at the community level, which started from when Bashir was still in office. So you've got as early as 2012 the community flood response, where members of the public, specifically youth, organize themselves to provide, you know, life-saving services to communities that have been affected by flooding in Khartoum and outside. Later, during the days of Hamdouk, there was an involvement from the members of the committee in safeguarding and applying, helping basically the civil governments apply economic reform policy. So they acted as a conduit between the civil government and the public on the matters of the economy. So distribution, for example, of rations, food rations and whatnot. Later on in 2020, they were also instrumental in running public health campaigns during COVID times, basically. Again, whatever shortages in kind of functionality and provision that the state had, these committees, these civic groups kind of, you know, stepped in to fill the gap. At a later stage, and just before the coup, you had the committees as part of their kind of evolving political project or civic project. They were questioning revenue raising and the role of local government, the municipalities, how they were spending their money, how they were redistributing their budgets. And this is, again, part of a more engaged civic, you know, aspect of civic politics that we saw, you know, in the period before the coup. For all these reasons, we should note that there has been an accumulated technocratic knowledge on service provision and state-citizen relationship. That's part of this kind of, you know, civic know-how that's accumulating. I thought I was going to get more than 15 minutes. Anyway, moving forward, just very quickly, all of what I've mentioned has implication for humanitarian intervention in this war period. So I mean, we encourage humanitarian actors and donors to consider a more civic kind of friendly model when thinking about distributing humanitarian aid in Khartoum and, you know, the kind of extended satellite cities. Obviously, the civic actors, they're present, they're on the ground, they've got systems in place, and they've got an ideology that drives it. Finally, I just wanted to kind of give a quick note on the information gap in Sudan and the role of civic actors in dealing and kind of, you know, in overcoming it. So Kholood spoke about yesterday about how the war was fought on 3 fronts, and one of them was, you know, the misinformation problem. I think there's also another problem, which is one of methodology. And it's not just propaganda that's on social media and everywhere that kind of drives, you know, misinformation, possibly problematic policy as a result. But the fact that sometimes there are certain actors online and other places that kind of, you know, employ methodologies that are borrowed from other contexts and try and fit it to the Sudan context with, you know, grave implications. So you've got platforms and users like this, for example, on social media. And this, I think the War Mapper application and system was created for Ukraine, and now it's being applied for Sudan. However, the kind of logic and terminology that sometimes is used doesn't fit the Sudanese realities. So terms like, you know, capture and advance and takeover in the context of Sudan, where, you know, the structure of urbanity is a bit different, you know, presents a set of problems, and maybe Deen can talk about this with a little more detail later. Can you move to the second one? And this is also continued, so they kind of, you know, so apparently the green is SAF, the red is RSF, and they're talking about how, you know, both armed actors are trying to kind of overtake the city. But again, this tells us very little about what's happening with the people, with their needs. So it's not a people-centered approach to try and understand the war on the ground and how it's affecting the public. If you could move on to the next one. So again, it's a problem of methodology, trying to kind of, you know, use kind of, you know, applications and system that doesn't fit the context. Here you've got another user. I mean, I've covered his name for ethical reasons, but this person has probably millions of followers, and he speaks about, you know, gives updates on the Sudan with a degree of authority. And here he's providing a cultural account to try and kind of, he's trying to kind of, you know, map or describe with using cultural differentiation, the difference between SAF and RSF. And in a war that's ethnically charged, these kind of narratives are very dangerous. So if you move on to the next slide. So this is how SAF is, the army is being described. Using obviously their uniforms, the colors, a little bit of kind of, you know, description of their faces, their demeanors. If you move on to the next slide. RSF is described as a group of people who wear the Commodore. And I mean, that's a very problematic way of, I mean, borrowing from culture to try and kind of, you know, designate a specific group with an armed ideology. If you move on. Instead, you've got more kind of, you know, positive approaches towards trying to kind of, you know, collect data on the ground and try and provide some analysis. And this is an app that was created by Civic groups in Sudan, and it's called Amen, which means safe. And this is the first of the applications to come out, and it was designed to provide safe passage. So it's designed with the purpose of evacuating the public from places of you know, battles and insurgent activities to more safe spots. And in getting the information, there's a huge, I mean, the reliance is mostly on crowdsourcing. So a lot of people are providing information, and then it's being analyzed and then published on the app. So this is just to give you kind of a spectrum of the kind of different interventions, how the ones that are produced by local actors take a people-centered approach with more positive outcomes, while external ones are a bit more generic and can possibly cause some, you know, Yes, but they also kind of clash with the do no harm kind of approach to humanitarian intervention. So I'm just gonna stop here. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Raja. So just to recap, yes. So Raja's painted a really in-depth, detailed portrayal of kind of the complexities of understanding what's taken place on the ground. And I think we need to do a lot of work to move from that and to kind of translate that challenge at the international level, which Kholood will speak to. And hopefully we can open up the floor in more detail to really work out kind of this constant question that we're always asked at these things of sort of what next and how do you make sense of this? And I mean, kind of what are the policy implications of this? So we'll get to that more towards the end. And with that, who's Kholood?
Good morning, everyone. I think Raja hit the nail on the head when she said that Sudan has been a living laboratory of international approaches towards, peace processes, political resolutions, all sorts of processes that, frankly, I think we can pretty much say have not succeeded. I think the international response has been marked by three things. One, it's been marked by selective unity. Two, it invariably leans towards armed actors. And three, it's stuck reproducing the same historical errors. So what do I mean by that? In terms of selective unity, we've had sort of an alphabet soup of different international constructs, whether it's the Quad or the Troika or the tripartite mechanism, and they're all sort of meant to be working together. But in actual fact, they don't. Oftentimes, there's a bit of competition, whether it's for resources or for attention or for international clout. Sometimes it's a personality issue, and they don't get along, they don't share information widely, they don't trust each other. But of course, if you read any of their statements, it's all, we support the tripartite mechanism. And then when you speak to diplomats in private, they're like, my God, I can't stand that. Those people, because they don't do what they say they're doing. So obviously there's a bit of a dissonance there. And I think that dissonance is a very clear thread throughout, not just in the engagement between these different actors, but also in the ways that they approach these different processes. And in that selective unity, it's also not very surprising that they are looking for certainties, and the certainties invariably involve state-based institutions. So what we have seen, despite the catalog of different abuses committed by armed actors in Sudan, time and again we have seen the international community go to them for either guidance or for support for an approach, or to be part of a political process. And that has happened at the expense of including other political entities, as Raja has outlined, that tend more towards civicness. And primarily that has been in the resistance committees or the neighborhood committees that Raja has mentioned. And these are, small, well, not small, neighborhood organizations that stretch across the country. They have varying degrees of engagement, varying degrees of entrenchment within their neighborhoods, but they are by and large across the entire country. The international community, as a sort of mosaic of different state-based organizations, be they diplomatic missions or regional or bodies like the AU and IGAD, or international bodies like the UN, etc. Being state-based bodies, they have a state lens when they look at any political context. And so they find amorphous hierarchical institutions like the resistance committees illegible. They don't know how to read them. There's no clear hierarchy. There's no clear leadership. There is no sort of quote unquote focal person with whom they can just pick up the phone and have a discussion. That's to be understood. That's pretty understandable, I think. The issue is that no proper, no sufficient attempts were made at trying to understand how these resistance committees work, particularly when they have shown over the period of the past 4 or 5 years that they have been, one, the most robust and enduring political entity. 2, they have been the most effective. And 3, they have been the most consensus-driven and coalition-driven. And of course, fragmentation of political bodies and elite capture has been the hallmark of Sudanese politics. They have, to some greater degree, resisted that more than any other political grouping in Sudan. And yet that still didn't qualify them to be given the due clout and respect, I think, by the international community. And so what we've seen instead is a tendency either towards these hierarchical institutions, the Sudan Armed Forces, the Rapid Support Forces, who of course are at war right now, or individuals, and particularly, for example, the former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok. Now, those logics continue to today. So even though we are in a state of war, and Prime Minister Hamdok has not been at the helm of any Sudanese government for a while now, he is still considered a locus of consensus within Sudan. Now, that doesn't make sense, I think, to anybody watching this from near or far. But the point is that they can pick up the phone and dial his number, and they will get him, and he will give them some information. And, you know, it's sort of he's the low-hanging fruit. But unfortunately, he doesn't have that much, you know, consensus on the ground. So why is he continuing to speak for the Sudanese people? A tendency towards individuals rather than a collective, I think, has led us to where we are. The fact that individuals feel that they, within the operating environment that we have all created, including the international community, as long as they're able to capture that as individuals with very little resistance, they feel that there's all to play for. We're seeing this pan out very much now in the mediations between Burhan and Hemeti. So that's something that we need to think about. How do we move away from individuals into collectives? How do we move away from not bothering to engage with slightly more difficult to read and slightly more difficult to reach groups, and doing so in a proactive way? And my last point is that it reproduces the humanitarian response, and the international response has reproduced historical errors. You know, we have seen, for example, in 2019, the massacre, in 2021, the coup, in 2023, now the war, and the international community response has not changed throughout all of those different events. At no point has there been a pause to reconfigure or to re-engage with different actors. Now, it begs the question, what is the red line? Are we talking chemical weapons? Are we talking another genocide? Or is that not even a red line? And at which point do we say, actually, perhaps these people that we have engaged for far too long should not be the people we rely on for Sudan's stability. They should not be the people we rely on for regional stability, because of course this engages the entire region. So when it comes to, interestingly, someone from the region just said to me, you know, we've been through this too, and my advice to you as people in Sudan is don't trust anyone, which I think is quite fitting, actually. When it comes to the humanitarian response, and I only have 7 minutes, so I'll end briefly. There's, you know, the way we gauge the humanitarian response has different metrics. So for people on the ground, it's how many people have we reached, how many people have, you know, shelter, how many people have we moved from one unsafe place to another. But speaking to humanitarian actors, particularly on the donor side, oftentimes it's how much money have we put into this, how much money is being absorbed, what kind of organizations are we working with. And when you're approaching these things from very different metrics, you get an international community that is incredibly frustrated by the fact that it can't find NGOs in the UN who's able to have access on the ground, and local and community actors, of whom the resistance committees are a part, a very important part, who are unable to access that funding, who are unable to access that humanitarian aid because they can't absorb $3.2 million of a specific funding stream. So we have to find a way to reconcile those things. The reality is that on the ground right now, as the war is raging, the only people who are able to give and provide any kind of humanitarian support are the people who've always been doing so. As Rajat said, as early as 2012, when we had floods, which we will have again this year, it's a yearly occurrence, the regional and the sort of the neighborhood, the local committees formed a community-based response, humanitarian response. And that culture and that tradition has been maintained until now. Actually, it's a culture that predates even 2012. But unless we are able to funnel the right kind of humanitarian support through these groups and to these groups, but on their terms, without creating NGOs out of them, because that would be the death knell for them, frankly. Unless we're able to do that, we're going to have everyone's going to be increasingly frustrated that nothing is done. I think there's going to be an increasing embarrassment on the international scale that 2 months in, not much humanitarian aid that has actually gone through. That is, I think, worse than we have seen in any other kind of similar or even dissimilar complex situation. And frankly, given the state and the level of violence, not just in Khartoum, but also in Darfur, that is unconscionable. And unless we're able to bring those two things together, I think we're going to continue to see those frustrations on all sides, and we're going to continue to see loss of life. The last point I'll end on is we cannot divorce the humanitarian support from the political support. So it's no good saying, great, we'll use these resistance committees because they're on the ground to do some humanitarian response, but we actually won't give them any political credibility when it comes to mediation platforms and engagement. The two have to go together because it's a sort of mutually reinforcing thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kholood. We'll move on to Deen Sharp.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. And firstly, I just wanted to start by saying what a huge honor it is to speak on a panel with Raga and Kholood, who I've learned so much from, and about Sudan, where I've been based for the past year, and also was luckily here on holiday out of pure chance when the war broke out, and learned 2 days later that my house was shelled, and luckily we were not in there with our 2-year-old child. But the point being, what I want to start was, this is a conflict that has entered people's homes in a very real and literal way, and to remember and also frame your analysis and ways of seeing with that conceptual framework and material reality as well, because there's nothing that stings more than losing your home and your belongings and your sense of community and place. And interestingly, as a geographer, I'm fascinated by the way in which this conference or workshop is organized around spatial concepts of borders and scales. And I'll go into a bit more the efficacy of changing scales and the way in which that can also change the frameworks in which you're analyzing. So I'm an urban geographer that focuses very much on the urbanization of the Arab world. An essential theme of my work has been around the urbanization of violence and warfare that has an enormous implication for the way urban processes are conducted, and equally, in turn, the way war is carried out. I just want to give you a snippet of some of the work that I've been doing, because I know that spatial and urban planning and these types of processes can be quite esoteric for many that are not used to these. But some of the work that I've been doing in the context of Syria, for instance, has been looking at, as Matt mentioned in the introduction, this concept of herbicide, which is the deliberate destruction of the built environment. And to look at, I'm sure you've all seen these vast scenes of urban destruction, but not just to look at that as wanton destruction, that this is just the necessary evil of war. But there's a very deliberate and purposeful targeting of residences, of offices, of shopping malls, and to use urban theory and frameworks such as herbicide to think through, okay, what are the underlying logics? And some of the work I've also been doing is to think that war is not only about destruction, but it is equally as much as the construction and organization of the built environment of cities and planning. Indeed, in the case of Khartoum, for instance, you can see, like, as an early warning sign that's come up in a lot of conversations yesterday, one of the largest building projects that was going on was a concrete wall around the military headquarters. And, in the American case of the invasion of Baghdad, of Iraq, for instance, someone called David Kilcullen, who was the central architect of the coin strategy, also said one of the central ways that they killed Baghdad was to implant cement barriers. So this is very much the way in which construction can be equally part of warfare, and to be attentive to those processes, because in turn, it has enormous implications for processes like reconstruction that is often automatically linked to post-war conflicts. And the work that I'm doing, just publishing a book called Reconstruction as Violence, and is to show very clearly how the Assad regime, almost immediately from the start of the Syrian conflict, started to change legal frameworks, started to clear certain areas of land that were deemed to be oppositional to the regime in preparation of the reconstruction, so that the battlefield is every much as built as it is deconstructed. Other concepts, that I've been working on that are also very important to the way warfare is done is things like urban informality, ashwaiyat, as it's often known, referred to in the Arab world and in Arabic. And in Egypt, for instance, there's been a real focus on clearing ashwaiyat areas, the eradication of these, and a lot of application also to the Khartoum context in Sudan. And the ways in which these forms of urban categories are being weaponized. And to also think, what is actually being referred to when something is being called informal? What are the legal regimes that created these concepts? One paper as I did, if you look back in Egypt, for instance, you can date it back to a World Bank document that was subcontracted to a consultancy firm. And they were using to create this category of urban informalities, completely outdated laws that actually dated to the colonial time. And unsurprisingly, they got urban informality rates of 90%. But what were they actually identifying in this division between the urban informal and the formal? And who were they kind of elevating, and what repercussions has that had to today, and the sorts of urban visions and processes that created, and what gets to live and all too often what doesn't. So these are the kinds of questions that I've been interrogating. I haven't got a lot of time, so I'm going to quickly just go into some of the aspects in this current conflict and what this research can also tell us about what's going on in Sudan. In many respects, Sudan is a majority rural country, but there are just two important things to say in relation to that. One is that definitions of urban and rural differ in every country, in every region, and this is a contentious academic debate as it is one in policy. But to look at also in Sudan in the way that the rural itself have been urbanized, and you've got large agro companies coming in and doing large farms, a lot of Gulf investment that's been very well documented by academics, and that this is also changing the nature of rural life, and it's also changing the nature of urban centers and urbanization. And to say that this conflict that is going on at the moment is decidedly urban and part of a global trend of urbanization of conflict. Of course, there is a long history of urban violence, but it's really accelerating in quite unprecedented ways. And we see, around the world that conflict is now, the epicenter of conflict is often in dense urban centers rather than in open fields or marshes that may have happened in previous decades. And that then conflict often revolves around key infrastructure. Immediately we saw in the case of Sudan, it was airports. And in the case of Khartoum, the airport is in the very center of the city. And then also to certain elite neighborhoods like Amarat and these areas and the implications of that. But it's not just airports, it's also electricity, basic urban services that are weaponized. And again, this goes back to how a battlefield can be designed. The ways in which, certain areas are allowed electricity and others not, water services, and you can actually shut off a city pretty quickly and make it uninhabitable. And the way in which groups do that to target certain populations, we see again and again from the Syrian conflict to the Sudanese, quite efficacious. And some of the earlier assessments of the conflict in Sudan has shown that 2/3 of fighting between SAF and RSF has been in urban areas of 100,000 people and over. So this is a distinctly urban conflict with all those urban dynamics that I've been referring to deeply embedded within it. And an important point was made yesterday that the conflict is not just in Khartoum. And of course, we've seen in Darfur ferocious and ongoing violence. But it is to say, of course, that Khartoum is very important to this conflict, and that is why there has been such ferocious fighting over these key infrastructures, like airports and roads that, of course, connect to various other areas and regions. And going back to what Raja was pointing to in terms of the maps, and maps as a way of seeing. As a geographer, I've got a lot of respect for maps. But they can be very deceiving, or also frame a certain analysis in a very certain way. One of the key goals often of military conflict is to control mobility. And checkpoints have immediately become a central element of this conflict. And of course, maps don't always enable you to see those mobilities rather than borders. And these wonderful colors of this area is SAF and this area is RSF, again, doesn't give you always the key importance of what are the key roads and who controls it, what checkpoints are there, who's allowed in and who isn't. And these forms of mobility, and as I was saying also in relation to basic urban services and infrastructures, and who controls them and who's getting it. Because it is, to just end my analysis on a third and final point, is that urban violence and conflict is not only just about deconstruction and construction, but also the flow and provisions of these basic urban services that are so essential to urban life and get immediately targeted by groups to control territories and borders. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it'll be helpful to recap. So basically, Raja's done an excellent job of trying to really show that so much about what goes on in revolution is actually arguing about what a revolution is about. And that's super, super messy, super contentious. Her ongoing work and our ongoing work is really trying to unpack that and articulate that. And not only that, but what is this imagination of what the future is? What is the imagination of how things ought to be different at a huge level? And how do you collectively imagine and reimagine what society is, and on a scale that is deeply profound in a place that has been historically had power centralized within it in a way that is can be traced back to the Anglo-Egyptian condominium from the beginning of the last century into the present, if not even before with the Turkey and the Mahdiya before. So then we have the challenge of translating that to the international community, which does not actually know how to work with these sort of acephalous, large, collective organizations, which really represent literally kind of the will of the people embodied by this concept of civicness or medaniya. So with Kholood bringing in an excellent analysis of these shortcomings and actually a sympathetic portrayal of how difficult it is for many of you who are in the room who are literally trying your best to connect with this, but also struggling because it is not how the international system is built, which I think flags for us the challenge, not just, we talked a lot about the humanitarian challenges that exist because that's the urgent need at the moment, but it's also the political challenges which have been discussed in the peacekeeping and or peacemaking challenges, which Rajaz touched on, but something that's vitally missing from this and that we're still exploring, and as a big part of my own research, is actually looking at the economic factors that are missing from that. And how do you get people to be much more deeply involved in economic decision-making at the local level? And how do you connect the civicness medaniya stuff? So there's this broader process, which is also needs to be reimagined and has deep implications for the international system and how these things take place. And I think Deen and our concluding panelist has done a great job of showing what those lived realities are going to be, both kind of the herbicide that's taking place. Africa, as everyone here knows, is deeply urbanizing. Sudan is not an exception to that. With that comes the urbanization of conflict. With that comes a need to think through how does this take place in new ways. And this is a very big shift from previous conflicts, legacies of conflicts. I mean, really the last time that Khartoum was invaded on this scale was when the Sudanese managed to behead General Charles Gordon, and which led to the sort of first attempt that the British had in conquering Sudan. So I think that's a broad scale of what this is, and with that, there's these deep implications. Not only, and if we connect this with these broader cross-border themes of what's going on here, is that internal boundaries are taking deep, messy realities. I think Deen did a great job of connecting Rajaz's statements and clear maps on Twitter that sort of paint, misportray the messy reality of what's going on the ground and who's identifying with what and what is the local and what are these community boundaries and these sort of things taking place in the urban level. But we see that across the country taking place. And so there's these broader challenges of actually maybe Sudan, there's this fragmentation. How will the political center hold? Is there a political center? How is it going to work? Where is that revenue base coming from? We see that much of what's taking place in the conflict at the moment is from external financing, from illicit financial flows that go across the region and all these sort of things. So how do you bound that? Because it is not working in a state system. It's already, that's the reality. It's actually not fitting within this neat map of what is Sudan. It is much more regional. So how do we work with that? And that's one of the biggest challenges that both connects our work within the Peace and Conflict Resolution platform, evidence platform, and also, of course, the cross-border program that we're doing our very best to kind of connect these local level things with these larger processes, which probably require a deeper reimagination of both the international system, but also of what is taking place in the first place.